This video clip is about samples and populations. So we're going to start with this term sample. So a good way of thinking about a sample is the sample is the actual people in your study. So sometimes we refer to the sample as the participants, sometimes we refer to it as the subjects. Basically, the sample is the people that you have collected data on. So looking at this data set over here, let's assume that we asked people in our class to report the number of siblings they had. So let's say they reported 0, 2, 1, 2, and 10 for a mean of 3. In this particular study, the sample is 5 people in our class. When you're asked to report what the sample is, I think one good word of advice is to always report the actual, in addition to your answer, always report the actual number. Because when you tell me the number, when you say 5 people, I know that you know it's these people right here. All right, so the sample is the actual people in your study. How does that differ from the population? Well, the population is the larger group of people from whom you drew your sample. Another way of thinking about it is it's the people that you want to make some sort of generalizations about. So sometimes the population is well defined, right? So sometimes when people set about to do research, they say in advance that their population is going to be X and that they're drawing the sample from this very specific and well-defined population. But a lot of times it's not well-defined like that. And a lot of times we need to really think about what the population is. All right, so let's assume that in this study the population wasn't well-defined in advance. So let's think about the populations that we could talk about in terms of this particular sample. So we drew this sample from 5 people in our class. So maybe the population is the whole class. Maybe the population is the whole school. Maybe the population is the whole town. And going even larger, maybe the population is the whole country. All right, any of those are fine. We could talk about any of those as populations. As long as the researcher hasn't defined in advance what the population is, you could potentially argue that any of those are the population. All right, the point being, it's the larger group of people from whom you drew your sample, and in addition to that, it's the people that you want to make generalizations about. So when the sample is a good representation of the population, you have external validity. All right, so let's really try to decompose what I'm talking about here. So let's assume for a second that our sample is the 5 people in our class and that the population is the whole class. Are these 5 people a good representation of the whole class? Probably. I mean, we don't know a lot of details about these 5 people. Are they all females and we excluded the males? Are they all older students and we excluded the younger students? We don't know any of that, but we can probably make a relatively good assumption that if we randomly drew this sample from the class, that this sample is a good representation of the whole class. So if we're talking about these 5 people and the whole class, we probably do have good external validity. The larger the population gets, the broader it gets from the actual sample, the less external validity you have. So if our population is the whole school, do 5 people in one particular class represent the whole school? Well, it's probably less likely. You have to assume that depending on the class, it might be just a specific major. If we're talking about our class, it's probably primarily psych majors. So do psych majors represent the whole school? You probably have a reduced external validity in this case. Moving even wider to the whole town, do 5 people in one college class represent a whole town full of people? Probably not. and then going to the whole country, do 5 people in a single class represent the whole country? It's highly unlikely. All right, so why do I use these kind of unlikely examples at all if the external validity is bad? Well, if you look at a lot of research articles, particularly research articles in psychology, when you look at the sample and you look at the population, often the population that they're hoping to draw conclusions about is something like all adults, and their sample might be a bunch of freshmen taking a Psych 101 class. So when the population is all adults or a whole country, and your sample is undergraduate college students, you probably don't have good external validity. And if you're ever asked to critique a research article, this is one easy place to go. This is one place that I always recommend students go at the beginning if they're trying to critique a research article, because it's very common in psychology for the sample to be undergrads and the population to be all adults. All right, and then the last thing I want to talk about really quickly in terms of sample and population is something called subject mortality. So when we talk about subject mortality, which is a real issue in research, what we're talking about here is subject loss. Now, we don't mean that the subjects have died. What we mean is that for some reason or another, they dropped out of our study. All right, so this is particularly an issue when you have longitudinal studies where participants are asked to come back over and over and over again. And it's also an issue when you have studies where you're asking students or where you're asking participants to do something that's very taxing or difficult. So if you're asking them to run, for example, for an extended period of time, a lot of people can't do that, so they might drop out of the study before completing whatever manipulation it is that you want them to do. All right, so again, main thing here, sample is the people in your study. Good word of advice when you're answering a question about sample, always mention the number. And the population is the larger group that you're drawing your sample from. And again, a lot of times in general, but also a lot of times on assignments that I give you, I'm not going to define what the population is. I want you to tell me what you think makes sense in terms of a population, and then based on that, answer whether you think that population, the sample represents the population.